In the year 1206, the known world was not expecting to be conquered. China, the richest, most populous civilization on Earth, sat behind the greatest wall humanity had ever built. Defended by armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, the Islamic Caliphate stretched from Spain to Central Asia, a civilization of philosophers, mathematicians, and warriors that had already survived the Crusades and the collapse of Rome. The Persian Empire had endured for 1,000 years. The Russian princes commanded vast lands of frozen forest. The knights of Christian Europe had forged the finest heavy cavalry the continent had ever produced. Every one of these powers would be shattered within a single lifetime. Not by another great civilization, not by a richer empire or a more advanced technology, but by a people who had no cities, no writing, no fixed borders, a people who lived in felt tents, followed their herds across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, and had spent the previous century doing nothing more than killing each other in tribal feuds that left no winners. The Mongols. At the height of their power, the Mongol Empire covered 24 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the entire African continent. It stretched from the Pacific coast of Korea to the doorstep of Vienna. From the frozen taiga of Siberia to the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia. It was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. And it was built in less than 80 years. No empire before it had ever moved this fast. No empire since has ever moved this fast. And no empire before or since has ever come from so little. This is the story of how that happened. It is a story about one of the most extraordinary individuals ever to walk the earth. A man who began his life as a slave and ended it as the ruler of half the known world. It is a story about the most lethal military machine ever assembled before the invention of gunpowder. It is a story about destruction so total that some regions of the Middle East have still not fully recovered 8 centuries later. And about a peace so profound that a merchant could travel safely from China to Europe for the first time in human history. It is a story about what happens when the world's greatest civilizations discover, too late, that they have been looking in the wrong direction. It begins not in a palace, not in a throne room, and not on a battlefield. It begins on the steppe, the vast, wind-scoured grassland that stretches across the heart of Asia. A landscape so brutal and so relentless that it shaped the people who lived on it into something the settled world had no framework to understand. Let us begin there. Asterism. Chapter 1. The Broken Steppe. A world of tribes and blood, before 1162. To understand the Mongols, you must first understand the steppe. Imagine a landscape that goes on forever. Not the romantic forever of an ocean. With its movement and color and life. A harder forever. Flat grassland stretching to every horizon. Broken only by the occasional shallow river or rocky outcropping. Baking under a summer sun fierce enough to crack leather. Then freezing under a winter cold so extreme that horses have been found standing dead, frozen solid where they stood. Unable to move quickly enough to survive the killing blizzards that sweep the land without warning. This is the Eurasian steppe. It runs in an almost unbroken band from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east, a distance of more than 8,000 kilometers. For most of recorded history, the settled civilizations to its south and west regarded it with a mixture of fear and contempt. Fear because it periodically produced warriors who swept down and burned their cities. Contempt because nothing of what they considered civilization could survive there. No agriculture, no permanent settlements, no written laws. What they missed was that the steppe had its own civilization, older than Rome. Older than Greece. Older than most of what we call civilization. Built not on stone and grain but on grass and horses. The horse changed everything on the steppe. A single family on horseback could manage a herd of hundreds of animals, moving them across vast distances to find the seasonal pastures that made survival possible. The horse gave steppe people speed, range, and a mobility that no settled army could match. A Mongol warrior on horseback could cover 100 kilometers in a single day. He could fight at full gallop with accuracy that took European knights years of training to approach. And he could do it since childhood. Mongol children were on horseback before they could walk properly. And they learned to shoot the compound bow before they learned to write. Because on the steppe, the bow and the horse were the only riding that mattered. But the steppe gave, and the steppe took. The grasslands could not support large, permanent populations. A single harsh winter, what the Mongolians called a dzud, when snow crusted over the grass and the animals starved, could wipe out a family's entire herd in weeks and condemn them to slow starvation. Rain was unreliable. Rivers could shift course. The grass that supported a tribe one year might be scorched the next. Life on the steppe was life in a state of permanent, low-grade emergency, and this shaped the cultures that arose on it in ways that the settled world found difficult to comprehend. There were no cities and therefore no walls to hide behind. There were no granaries to sustain a siege. There was no fixed territory worth dying to defend. Because the entire point of steppe life was mobility, the ability to move with the seasons and the grass. This meant that warfare on the steppe was nothing like warfare in the settled world. It was not about taking and holding territory. It was about people, about livestock, about horses, and about the human beings who herded them. Raiding a rival tribe to take their animals was not considered crime. It was considered survival, and it was considered skill. The young man who came home with 50 horses he had not left with was admired, not condemned. By the 12th century, the century into which Genghis Khan would be born, the steppe between Lake Baikal and the Gobi Desert was a patchwork of competing tribes locked in a cycle of raid, counter-raid, blood feud, and fragile alliance that had been running, with brief interruptions, for as long as anyone could remember. The tribes had names that would become famous: the Mongols, the Tatars, the Khanates, the Naimans, the Merkits. They shared the same landscape, the same way of life, and the same fundamental problem. None of them was strong enough to dominate the others. And the effort to try simply perpetuated a cycle of violence that weakened everyone. To the south and east, the Jin dynasty of northern China watched this tribal chaos with satisfaction. A unified steppe was dangerous. It had produced the great nomadic confederacies before. The Xiongnu and the Gokturks, whose raids had driven Chinese emperors to build walls across entire mountain ranges. A divided steppe, on the other hand, was merely a source of cheap border trouble. Chinese imperial policy actively encouraged the divisions among the steppe tribes, playing them against each other with trade incentives and diplomatic marriages, ensuring that no single figure could rise far enough to threaten the settled world. It was a policy that had worked for centuries. It was about to fail completely. Into this world of organized chaos, sometime around 1162, a child was born to the wife of a minor Mongol chieftain on the banks of the Onan River in what is now northeastern Mongolia. His father, Yasuge, was the leader of a small subclan, powerful enough to matter locally, not powerful enough to challenge the larger tribal powers that surrounded him. His mother, Hulan, had been abducted from another tribe on the very day of her wedding to a different man, a common enough occurrence in a world where women moved between clans like livestock and had roughly as much say in the matter. The child was born, legend tells us, clutching a blood clot in his right fist. The shamans who attended the birth regarded this as an omen. They named him Temujin, after a Tatar warrior his father had just captured and brought home in chains. The name meant something like iron, or blacksmith. It would prove appropriate. Asterism. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Should Have Died. 1162 to 1185. The first thing you need to understand about Temujin's childhood is that it was designed, by circumstance, to destroy him. He was 9 years old when his father died. Yasuge had ridden to a camp of Tatars, his family's enemies, to negotiate a marriage for young Temujin with the daughter of a rival clan, a girl named Borte. On the way home, he accepted food and drink from the Tatars at their camp. It was a fatal courtesy. The Tatars poisoned him. He died 3 days later, barely making it back to his own camp, and left behind a widow with 5 young children, a teenage stepdaughter, and no adult man to protect them. On the steppe, a family without a male protector was not a family. It was a target. The clan elders met and made a decision that was, by the brutal logic of steppe survival, entirely rational. They abandoned Hulan and her children. To feed 5 young children through a winter on the steppe was a drain on resources the clan could not afford. The children would likely die anyway. Better to cut the loss now. And so the widow and her children were left behind, alone, on the steppe, as winter approached. What happened next is one of the most remarkable survival stories in human history, not because it involved extraordinary heroism or military genius, but because it involved a woman and her children simply refusing to die. Holland dug roots from the frozen ground. She gathered wild berries and pine nuts. She taught her children to fish through the ice of the Onon River. She made them hunt mice and marmots with small bows when there was nothing larger to eat. There were winters, the sources suggest, when the family survived on nothing but boiled leather. They survived. But survival, on the steppe, was never enough. You needed allies. You needed blood ties, or sworn brotherhood, or a patron powerful enough to shield you from the raids that could come at any time from any direction. Temujin grew up knowing this with a clarity that only poverty and vulnerability can produce. He understood, with the visceral certainty of someone who had felt what it meant to have no one, that the central problem of steppe life was not strength. It was loyalty. The question was not how to be powerful. The question was how to build a group of people who would not abandon you when the winter came. The steppe had an answer for this. It was called Enda, sworn brotherhood. A bond between two men that was supposed to supersede even blood ties. Temujin formed his first Enda bond with a boy named Jamuka, the son of a rival clan. When both of them were children, they exchanged gifts, swore oaths, and became, in the language of the steppe, closer than brothers. Jamuka would later become his greatest enemy. When Temujin was around 15, he tracked down and reclaimed Borte, the girl his father had chosen for him years before. The marriage was important not just personally but politically. Her clan, the Ongirets, was an ally worth having. Within months of the marriage, disaster struck again. A raiding party of Merkits, a powerful tribe to the north who had a long-standing grievance against Temujin's family, swept through his camp in the night, took his horses, scattered his followers, and abducted Borte. For most men in Temujin's position, this would have been the end. A young chieftain with no clan, no wealth, and no army did not demand his wife back from the Merkits. He grieved and moved on. Or he died trying. Temujin did something different. He went to Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Karat tribe, who had been his father's Enda, his sworn brother, and called in that debt. Then he went to Jamuka, his own Enda. Between the two alliances, he assembled a force of roughly 30,000 warriors and fell upon the Merkit camps at night. He got Borte back. He also learned something that he would never forget, that the sworn obligations of the steppe could be leveraged. That alliances could be built from nothing if you were willing to ask the right questions of the right people. And that speed and surprise were worth more than numbers. The Merkits had not expected a young man with no clan of his own to come for his wife with an army. They had been wrong to underestimate him. Almost everyone would be. Asterism. Chapter 3. The Forging of Genghis Khan. 1185 to 1206. The 2 decades between Temujin's first alliance and his proclamation as universal ruler of the Mongols were not a steady rise to power. They were a series of collapses and recoveries. Betrayals and counter-betrayals. Alliances built and built again. That would have broken any man without an unusual combination of qualities: patience, ruthlessness, strategic vision, and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in the people around him. He needed all of it. The key to understanding how Temujin rose is understanding what he changed about the steppe's fundamental social structure. The steppe had always organized itself around blood. Your tribe was your clan, and your clan was your blood, and your loyalty ran upward through the family hierarchy regardless of whether the man above you deserved it. A chief's son became a chief whether or not he was capable. A warrior followed his kinsman into battle whether or not his kinsman was worth following. This system had a certain stability, but it was deeply inefficient. It locked talent below incompetence and it made disloyalty a kinship crime rather than a rational calculation. Temujin dismantled it. His revolution was simple in concept and radical in execution. Loyalty would be rewarded. Regardless of bloodline, a man who served him faithfully would be elevated, given command, given wealth, given the kind of security that the steppe had never reliably provided anyone. A man who betrayed him would be destroyed, regardless of who his father was. Conversely, and this was perhaps the most radical part, an enemy who fought bravely and honorably would be offered the chance to join. His famous generals, the men who would later lead armies across Asia, came from every background: slaves, orphans, warriors from enemy tribes who had been defeated and then recruited. He also ended, among his followers, the practice of looting after battle. On the steppe, raiding was about taking things: horses, women, livestock. An army that paused to loot was an army that could not pursue, could not maintain discipline, could not be trusted to hold its position when something more tempting presented itself. Temujin decreed that plunder would be distributed centrally. After the battle was fully won and the enemy fully secured, he did not ask his men to stop wanting wealth. He asked them to trust him to deliver it, and then he delivered it consistently, so that the trust was earned rather than demanded. These changes, combined with a series of calculated military campaigns, brought tribe after tribe under his control through the 1190s and early 1200s. The Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father, were conquered and their leading men executed. The Khanates, under Togrul, were broken after a falling out that turned his patron into his enemy. His old Enda Jamuka was the last to fall, a man of equal intelligence and perhaps greater charisma, who had built his own powerful confederation on the steppe. When Jamuka was finally defeated and brought before Temujin, he was offered his life in exchange for submission. He refused. He asked to be executed in the manner reserved for the nobility, without the shedding of blood. Temujin granted it. Jamuka's back was broken. In 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, the same river where Temujin had been born into poverty 44 years before, a great Kurultai was convened. A Kurultai was a gathering of all the Mongol clans, a political assembly of a kind the steppe had rarely seen at such scale. Every significant tribe and subclan sent representatives. A great white banner of 9 yak tails was raised, and Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title is sometimes translated as universal ruler, sometimes as oceanic ruler, the idea being that his authority extended in all directions like the ocean, without boundary. The shamans proclaimed that eternal blue heaven had ordained his rule. The assembled warriors drove their swords into the earth and swore oaths. He was 51 years old. He had never commanded more than the tribes of his native steppe. He had never seen a walled city. He had never commanded artillery or siege engines or a navy or any of the tools that the settled world used to project power. In 21 years, he would conquer more of the earth than any man before or since. Asterism. Chapter 4. The War Machine. How the Mongols fought, the military revolution of the steppe. Before we follow the Mongols into their conquests, we need to stop and understand what they had built. Because the Mongol military was not simply a large army. It was a weapons system that the settled world had never encountered before, one that combined speed, coordination, intelligence, and psychological warfare in ways that made conventional military thinking not just inadequate but actively dangerous. The foundation was the horse. Every Mongol warrior rode, typically with a string of 3 to 5 horses that he rotated throughout a campaign, allowing him to cover distances that would exhaust any single mount cavalry force. The composite bow he carried, a recurved masterpiece of layered wood, bone, and sinew that took years to make and could be fired from horseback at full gallop, had an effective range of over 200 meters and a draw weight that could punch through the chainmail that protected European knights. He carried it in a waterproof case. He slept with it. It was, in the most literal sense, the tool by which he ate and fought and survived. But the individual Mongol warrior, formidable as he was, is not what made the Mongol army different. Armies of skilled steppe horsemen had existed before. What Genghis Khan added was organization. The Mongol army was structured on a decimal system of ruthless simplicity. 10 men formed an arban. 10 arbans formed a jagan of 100. 10 jaghuns formed a mingan of 1,000. And 10 mingans formed a tumen of 10,000. Every man knew his unit and his commander. Every commander was responsible for the readiness and performance of his men. Failure was punished collectively. If one man in a unit of 10 deserted, all 10 were executed. If 10 men in a unit of 100 deserted, the entire 100 faced death. This collective responsibility was not merely punitive. It created bonds of mutual dependence so strong that unit cohesion in battle became almost instinctive. The Mongols also created the first truly professional military intelligence network in history. Before any major campaign, they sent advance riders, not to scout terrain, but to gather information, trade routes, the political relationships between enemy leaders, the locations of water sources, the depth of river crossings, the loyalties of local populations who might be persuaded to act as guides. When the Mongol army finally moved, its generals knew the landscape and the political situation of their target with a thoroughness that their enemies found inexplicable and sometimes attributed to sorcery. Their battlefield tactics were built around the feigned retreat. A Mongol force would engage the enemy, appear to break, and flee. The enemy, cavalrymen who had trained their whole lives to pursue a fleeing foe, gave chase, and rode directly into an ambush, where the flanks of the Mongol army had been waiting, unseen, sometimes for hours. The tactic required a level of discipline that most medieval armies could not maintain: the ability to run from an enemy, to absorb the pursuit while preserving formation, and to wheel and attack at the precise moment the signal came. The Mongols drilled it until it was as natural as breathing. They also mastered siege warfare, a skill that no steppe people before them had possessed. The steppe had no walls worth sieging, and so steppe warriors had always broken against the defenses of settled cities like water against stone. Genghis Khan solved this problem methodically. He recruited Chinese engineers, Persian architects, and Central Asian craftsmen who understood counterweights and leverage and the physics of projectile motion. He learned, he watched, he asked questions until he understood what he was being told. Within a decade of his proclamation as Khan, the Mongol army could reduce almost any fortification in the world. But the most powerful weapon in the Mongol arsenal was not the bow, the horse, or the siege engine. It was the message that traveled ahead of the army. Genghis Khan developed a systematic policy of offering terms before every siege. The offer was simple: surrender immediately, open your gates, provide tribute and levies of soldiers and craftsmen, and be incorporated into the Mongol Empire with your institutions and your leaders largely intact. Resist, and the city would be destroyed completely, its walls demolished, its population put to the sword, its buildings burned, its very name removed from the landscape as thoroughly as possible. He meant it, both parts. The cities that surrendered, and there were many, were generally treated well. Their merchants traded, their craftsmen worked, their administrators administered. The cities that resisted were not simply conquered, they were erased. The Persian city of Merv, which resisted, was destroyed so thoroughly that contemporaries reported it took weeks to count the dead. The Tangut capital of Zhongxing was leveled so completely that its location was lost for centuries. The message traveled faster than the army, and it was the most effective recruiting tool in history: surrender or disappear. Most chose to surrender. This combination, unmatched mobility, devastating battlefield effectiveness, irresistible siege capability, and a psychological strategy that made resistance seem suicidal, is what made the Mongol Empire possible. Not numbers alone, not brutality alone, a system, designed and refined by a man who had spent his entire adult life thinking about how to break the resistance of other human beings. Now, with the steppe unified beneath his standard, Genghis Khan turned the system outward, and the world would never be the same. Asterism. Chapter 5. The conquest of the world begins. 1206 to 1227. The campaigns of Genghis Khan. The first target was not chosen for its wealth or its prestige. It was chosen because it was there, and because it had made the mistake of being rude. The Shi Shah, the Tangut kingdom of northwestern China, had been raiding Mongol territory for years. And when Genghis Khan sent envoys to demand submission, the Shi Shah ruler responded with contempt. This was a miscalculation that would cost his kingdom its existence. Between 1205 and 1209, the Mongols conducted a series of campaigns against the Shi Shah that served as both a military objective and a training exercise, a place to refine tactics, test commanders, and practice siege warfare against a sophisticated fortified enemy before turning toward larger prey. The larger prey was Jin dynasty China. The Jin, a Jurchen people who had conquered northern China in the early 12th century, were the dominant power in East Asia. Their empire contained perhaps 50 million people. Their army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their capital, Zhengdu, was one of the great cities of the medieval world, surrounded by walls, moats, and every fortification that centuries of Chinese military engineering could provide. They had, for generations, used the tribal divisions of the steppe as a buffer against exactly this kind of threat. The buffer was gone now, and the Jin were about to discover what that meant. In 1211, Genghis Khan led his armies south through the Gobi Desert and across the Great Wall, which turned out, in practice, to be much easier to bypass than anyone had assumed, since a wall is only as strong as the people defending it. And the people defending the Jin northern frontier were neither prepared nor motivated for what was coming. The Mongols swept through the northern provinces, not attempting to hold territory but destroying the Jin's ability to field armies. They lured Jin cavalry into the open and annihilated them with the feigned retreat. They bypassed heavily fortified cities rather than reducing them one by one, cutting off supply lines and leaving garrisons to wither in place. In 1215, Zhengdu fell. The Jin court had already fled south. The Mongols stripped the city of its craftsmen, its scholars, and its treasures, and left the rest in ashes. The smoke reportedly rose for weeks. The Jin campaigns revealed a pattern that would define all of Genghis Khan's major wars: the willingness to absorb what was useful from a conquered civilization and destroy what resisted. From the Jin, the Mongols took administrators, engineers, doctors, astronomers, and the concept of a centralized bureaucracy that could manage a multi-ethnic empire. A Jurchen administrator named Yelu Chusai became one of Genghis Khan's most important advisors, a man who would later convince the conqueror that living farmers paying taxes were more valuable than dead farmers who had refused to surrender. It was a lesson Genghis Khan took seriously. Sometimes. In 1219, he turned west. The reason was, again, a matter of rudeness taken to catastrophic extremes. The Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Islamic state controlling modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, had been approached by a Mongol trade mission. The Shah Muhammad II, either at his own order or through the incompetence of a border governor, had the merchants killed and their goods seized. When Genghis Khan sent envoys to demand an explanation, they too were killed. It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of this error. Genghis Khan spent nearly a year preparing the Western campaign with a care he had given to no previous war. He assembled an army of between 150,000 and 200,000 warriors, the largest force he had ever commanded. He gathered intelligence through a network of merchants and travelers who had been moving through the Khwarezmian Empire for years. He identified the key cities, the key passes, the key water sources. He planned not one line of advance but 3 simultaneous ones, intended to prevent the Shah's forces from concentrating. And then he moved with a speed that the Islamic world, which had survived the Crusades and considered itself the greatest military power in Central Asia, simply could not process. The Mongol army crossed the Sir Darya River in the winter of 1219 and split into its 3 columns. The Shah's strategy had been to defend his major cities individually, trusting their walls. It was exactly the wrong choice against an enemy that could surround a city completely, cut off all supply and communication, and maintain the siege while the other columns destroyed the forces that might have come to relieve it. Samarkand, the jewel of the Islamic world, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, ringed by walls and defended by a garrison of perhaps 110,000 soldiers, fell in 5 days. The garrison was offered terms. They surrendered. Most of the population survived. Bukhara, which resisted, did not survive in the same way. When Genghis Khan rode into Bukhara's great mosque and addressed the assembled population, he reportedly said, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether he actually said this, or whether it was attributed to him later, the sentiment was politically useful. The conquest was God's will, and resistance was not merely futile but impious. City after city fell. Some surrendered and were spared. Some resisted and were destroyed. Urgench, the Khwarezmian capital, resisted for months and was destroyed so thoroughly that the Amu Darya River was diverted to flow over the ruins. The Shah Muhammad fled westward and died alone on an island in the Caspian Sea, abandoned by his family. pursued to his last breath by a Mongol tracking force that never quite caught him. His empire, which had existed for less than 40 years, was gone, permanently. In 1226, Genghis Khan returned to settle accounts with the Shi Shah, who had refused to send troops for the Western campaign. He was already dying. Sources disagree on whether from a riding injury or illness, but he refused to halt the campaign. The Shi Shah were destroyed. Their cities were demolished, their population scattered, their records and history so thoroughly erased that historians still debate the details of their culture. Genghis Khan died in August of 1227. Somewhere in northwestern China, the Shi Shah campaign still in progress around him. He was approximately 65 years old. He had conquered more of the earth than any man in history. And he had given his successors the tools, the organization, and the ideology to continue. He also left a will. He specified, precisely, how the empire should be divided among his sons. And he specified which son, Ogedei, should be the next great Khan. He had thought about succession more carefully than almost any ruler in history. Because he had seen, all his life, what happened to power that was not carefully managed when its holder died. He left the empire to his people. They would spend the next 50 years proving both how far his vision could be extended, and how impossible it was to hold together. Asterism. Chapter 6. The Destruction of the Islamic World. 1227 to 1260, Ogedei, Monki, and the burning of Baghdad. When Genghis Khan died, the world had a moment to breathe. It was a short moment. His son and designated successor, Ogedei Khan, proved to be a capable ruler with a taste for wine and a talent for delegation that combined. Paradoxically, to make him effective, where Genghis had been a field commander who led from the front, Ogedei understood that an empire of this size required administration as much as conquest. He established a permanent capital at Karakoram, a city that, by the standards of the great urban centers the Mongols had destroyed, was modest almost to the point of embarrassment. A town of felt tents and a few permanent buildings on the steppe that nonetheless served as the administrative center of the largest land empire in history. He also continued conquering. In 1231, Mongol forces under the brilliant general Subutai, a blacksmith's son who had risen to become perhaps the greatest military mind of the medieval world, completed the destruction of the Jin dynasty, taking the last Jin emperor's capital and ending the dynasty that had ruled northern China for a century. In 1236, Subutai turned west. The Western Campaign of 1236 to 1242 is one of the most extraordinary military achievements in history. And it is almost completely unknown to Western audiences. Subutai led a force of approximately 140,000 warriors across the Volga and into the fragmented Russian principalities, destroying every major city in his path. Vladimir, Suzdal, Kiev, then one of the great cities of medieval Europe, was reduced to ash in 1240. A Polish army and a German Crusader army, combined, were annihilated at the Battle of Legnica. A Hungarian royal army was destroyed at the Battle of Mohi. Subutai's advanced scouts reached the Adriatic Sea. Europe had nothing that could stop them. Nothing. The Knights of the Holy Roman Empire, the Knights of France, the Knights of England, none of them had faced an army of this kind before. And none of the tactical responses that had served European heavy cavalry against other European heavy cavalry had any answer to horse archers who could outrun any pursuit, outshoot any static defense, and had already destroyed 3 major armies in 6 months. Then, in the spring of 1242, the Mongols stopped. They pulled back from the Adriatic. They retreated from Hungary. They reassembled east of the Carpathians and stood down. European chroniclers, who had been preparing for the end of Christendom, attributed the withdrawal to divine intervention. The actual reason was simpler and more sobering. Ogedei Khan had died in December of 1241. And Subutai's senior commanders needed to return to Karakoram to participate in the selection of the next great Khan. Europe was not saved by God. It was saved by Mongol succession politics. The succession crisis that followed Ogedei's death consumed a decade of Mongol energy and political maneuvering, regencies, and a brief civil war. When Monki Khan finally emerged as the new great Khan in 1251, he reorganized the empire, purged his rivals, and immediately began planning the next phase of conquest: the complete subjugation of the Islamic world and the final destruction of the Song dynasty in southern China. He gave the Western campaign to his brother Hulagu. What Hulagu did between 1256 and 1260 permanently altered the course of Islamic civilization. And the scars are still visible today. The first target was the Assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect based in the mountain fortresses of northern Iran, whose practice of political murder had made them feared across the Islamic world and whose fortresses were considered impregnable. The Mongols took them in a systematic campaign of siege warfare that lasted 2 years, capturing fortress after fortress, until the last assassin Grand Master surrendered and was executed. The assassin threat, which had terrorized the Islamic world for nearly 2 centuries, was ended in 24 months. Hulagu then turned toward Baghdad. Baghdad was not simply a city. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual center of Sunni Islam. The city that had been the intellectual and cultural heart of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. Its library, the House of Wisdom, contained texts from across the known world: Greek philosophy, Persian mathematics, Indian astronomy, the accumulated scholarship of 500 years of Islamic intellectual life. Its population numbered several hundred thousand. Its caliph, al-Mustazim, was the symbolic head of all Sunni Muslims on earth. He also made the same mistake that the Khwarezmian Shah had made. He underestimated what was coming. Hulagu sent envoys demanding submission. The caliph refused. He reportedly told Hulagu's ambassador that the entire Muslim world would rise to defend Baghdad, that God would not permit the destruction of his holy city, and that the Mongol army would be swept away like leaves before the wind. In January of 1258, the Mongol army surrounded Baghdad. The city fell within 2 weeks. What followed was one of the most catastrophic events in the history of Islamic civilization. The destruction of Baghdad lasted for days. The caliph was executed, wrapped in felt and trampled by horses. In keeping with the Mongol prohibition against spilling royal blood on the ground, the House of Wisdom was destroyed, its books thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities, according to contemporary accounts, that the water ran black with ink for days. Whether that specific image is literally true, the underlying fact is not in dispute. The greatest library in the Islamic world was destroyed. Centuries of scholarship, unique manuscripts, irreplaceable texts, gone. The intellectual infrastructure that had made Baghdad the most brilliant city in the medieval world was dismantled in days. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed since 750 CE, was ended. The office of Caliph, the spiritual successor to the Prophet, the unifying authority of Sunni Islam, was vacant for the first time in 5 centuries. Hulagu continued westward. The Syrian cities of Aleppo and Damascus fell in 1260. Hulagu's forces reached Gaza, on the border of Egypt, which was then ruled by the Mamluks, a dynasty of warrior slaves whose military culture had produced some of the finest soldiers in the Islamic world. And there, for the first time in the history of Mongol westward expansion, something stopped them. The Battle of Ain Jalut, in September of 1260, is one of the turning points of world history. A Mamluk army under the general Baybars engaged a Mongol force in the hills of Palestine and destroyed it. It was the first decisive defeat of a Mongol army in open battle. The Mongol advance into the Islamic heartland, which had seemed unstoppable, stopped. Several factors contributed. Hulagu had pulled the bulk of his army back east because of another succession crisis after Manki Khan's death. The force at Ain Jalut was not the full Mongol army. But Baybars and the Mamluks had also studied Mongol tactics with the same rigor that Genghis Khan had studied his enemies. They used the feigned retreat against the Mongols themselves, drawing the leading force into an ambush, and they won. The western limit of the Mongol Empire had been reached. The Islamic world had been permanently scarred. Regions of Iraq and Iran that had supported dense agricultural populations for thousands of years would not fully recover for centuries, as the irrigation systems that Mesopotamian civilization had built and maintained since the Sumerians were destroyed and never fully rebuilt. But Islam itself survived. The Mamluks held Egypt. The faith endured. And in a supreme irony that Genghis Khan would have appreciated, Within a generation, most of the Mongol rulers of the Islamic world had converted to Islam. The conquerors had been conquered by the culture they had tried to destroy. Asterism. Chapter 7. The Pax Mongolica. When the world had one road, 1250 to 1350. We have spent a great deal of time with fire and swords. And we should. The Mongol conquests were, by any measure, among the most destructive events in human history. Demographic historians estimate that the campaigns of Genghis Khan and his successors killed between 30 and 40 million people, a figure that represented perhaps 10% of the world's total population at the time. Some regions, particularly in Central Asia and northern China, did not return to their pre-conquest population levels for more than a century. But the Mongol Empire was not only destruction. At its height, it created something that had never existed before and would not exist again for centuries: a single unified political authority stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, under which the roads were safe, the merchants were protected, and the entire Eurasian landmass was, for the first and only time in history, connected by a single administrative system. Historians call this the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. To understand what this meant in practice, consider the problem of trade before the Mongol Empire. The Silk Road, the ancient network of routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, had existed for over 1,000 years. But traveling it was a profoundly dangerous enterprise. You crossed the territories of dozens of different political entities, each with its own rules, its own bandits, its own border tolls, and its own incentives to rob merchants who could not defend themselves. The practical result was that most long-distance trade was conducted through chains of intermediaries, each taking a cut, each adding delay, each adding risk. Goods moved slowly, expensively, and unreliably. Under the Pax Mongolica, a single law, the Yasa, the code of laws promulgated by Genghis Khan, governed the entire route from China to Hungary. Mongol relay stations, called Yam, were established every 25 to 30 kilometers along major routes, providing fresh horses and food for official travelers and, by extension, for the merchant caravans that moved under official protection. Armed escorts were available. Theft was punished with ferocity that made the punishment a genuine deterrent, under Mongol law. Robbery of a traveling merchant was a capital offense. The result was a transformation of Eurasian commerce. For the first time, it was genuinely possible for a single merchant to travel from Venice to Beijing. Marco Polo did not write a fantasy. He wrote a travel account. His father and uncle had made the journey before him and returned safely. The Mongol Empire made this possible. The exchange of goods was only the beginning. The exchange of ideas, diseases, technologies, and peoples that moved along these newly safe roads reshaped the world in ways that are still unfolding. Chinese technologies that had existed in the East for centuries, papermaking, printing, gunpowder, the mechanical clock, moved westward along Mongol roads and arrived in Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. European technologies and artistic traditions moved east. Persian astronomical knowledge traveled to China. Chinese medical practices reached the Middle East. The Mongol Empire was, among other things, the greatest technology transfer event in human history before the Industrial Revolution. The Mongol courts were, by the standards of most medieval governance, strikingly cosmopolitan. Kublai Khan's court at Khanbali, the city we now call Beijing, hosted ambassadors, merchants, missionaries, and scholars from across the known world. William of Rubric, a Flemish friar, traveled to Karakorum in the 1250s and found at the Khan's court Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and shamans all presenting their arguments to a ruler who listened with genuine curiosity and apparently found them all more or less equally unconvincing. The Mongols practiced a religious tolerance that was not merely pragmatic, though it was certainly that, but also reflected a genuine steppe tradition of acknowledging that the world contained more than one way of approaching the sacred. The dark reverse of this connectivity was also being carried along those roads. The Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that killed between a third and half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, traveled the Mongol roads. The bacterium Yersinia pestis was almost certainly present in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe long before the Mongol conquests. The trade routes that connected Central Asia to China, to the Middle East, to Europe also connected their rodent populations, their flea populations, and their disease reservoirs. The Pax Mongolica that allowed Marco Polo to travel safely to China also allowed plague to travel safely to Crimea, and from there to Sicily, and from there to the rest of Europe. The Mongol Empire gave the medieval world global trade. It gave the medieval world global plague. Both transformations were permanent. The cultural and intellectual efflorescence of the Pax Mongolica also produced some of the great works of Persian and Chinese literature and art. The Khanate of Persia, the Mongol successor state in Iran and Iraq, became a remarkable center of patronage, producing illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty, including, with supreme irony, illustrated histories of the Mongol conquests themselves. Painted in the finest tradition of Persian miniature art, the conquerors had been absorbed by Persian culture even as they funded Persian culture's continuation. In China, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty oversaw a period of remarkable cultural synthesis, producing innovations in drama, painting, and literature that drew on both Chinese and Central Asian traditions. The Grand Canal was extended. Foreign trade through Chinese ports reached levels that would not be matched for centuries. The Pax Mongolica was real. It was also temporary. It required the empire to remain unified. And the empire was already fracturing. Asterism. Chapter 8. The Limits of Conquest. Japan, Vietnam, and the Edges of the World, 1258 to 1294. Every empire discovers its limits. Rome found its limit on the Rhine and in the Scottish Highlands. The British found theirs in Afghanistan and on the American frontier. The Mongols, uniquely, found theirs not on land, where they remained undefeated in open battle throughout their imperial period, but in the water, in the jungle, in the monsoon, and in the particular combination of terrain and climate that made the world's margins resistant to the tactics that had swept everything before them on the open steppe. The most famous of these limits was Japan. Kublai Khan, who had completed the conquest of Song dynasty China in 1279 and ruled from Beijing as the Emperor of China, the first non-Chinese emperor in the country's long history, sent envoys to Japan in 1266 demanding submission. The Japanese regent, Hojo Tokumune, made a decision that was either the bravest or the most reckless in Japanese history. He had the envoys executed and prepared for invasion. The first Mongol invasion fleet arrived in 1274. It carried perhaps 30,000 warriors, a force that had crushed every army it had previously faced on the Asian mainland. The Japanese samurai who met it on the beaches of Kyushu encountered, for the first time, mass archery from composite bows, coordinated unit tactics, and weapons they had never seen, including bombs. Grenades thrown by catapult that exploded on impact with a sound that contemporary Japanese accounts described as thunder. The Japanese fought with extraordinary bravery and were being pushed back. Then a typhoon hit. The Mongol fleet, anchored offshore to avoid the night tides, was devastated. The invasion force withdrew. Kublai Khan spent 7 years preparing the second invasion. In 1281, he launched the largest amphibious assault in history to that point. 2 fleets totaling perhaps 4,500 ships and 140,000 men. The Japanese, who had spent the intervening years building defensive walls along the invasion beaches and training their armies in the new tactics, fought the Mongols to a bloody standstill on the shoreline for 7 weeks. Then, in August of 1281, a typhoon of historic proportions, what the Japanese called the kamikaze, the divine wind, struck the Mongol fleet. Contemporary accounts describe the destruction in terms that still feel overwhelming: ships overturned, entire squadrons driven onto the rocks, men drowned by the thousands. When the storm cleared, perhaps half the invasion force was dead, most of them drowned without ever having fought a battle. The survivors retreated. Kublai Khan's fleet, the most expensive military project in the history of the Yuan dynasty, was at the bottom of the Sea of Japan. He planned a third invasion. It was never launched. The cost of the first 2, combined with ongoing rebellions in Vietnam and the expenses of the Chinese administration, had strained the Yuan treasury beyond recovery. Japan remained unconquered. It was the only major power in Kublai Khan's reach that successfully resisted. The campaigns in Southeast Asia revealed a different limit: jungle and disease. Vietnam, then called Dai Viet, was invaded 3 times by Mongol forces. In 1257, 1284, and 1287, each time, the Mongol army captured the Vietnamese capital Hanoi relatively easily. Each time, the Vietnamese court retreated into the jungle and refused to fight the kind of open battle that the Mongols excelled at. Each time, the Mongol army, accustomed to the cold, dry air of the steppe and the temperate plains of China, was devastated by tropical disease. By the heat, by the inability to forage in a jungle landscape where their horses found no grass and their supply lines could not function. Each time, the Mongols eventually withdrew, citing the climate and the terrain as the reason. The Vietnamese commander Tran Hung Dao wrote a manual of guerrilla warfare based on his 3 campaigns against the Mongols that is still studied in Vietnamese military academies today. He had identified something important: the Mongols were not gods. They were a system, and like all systems, they had conditions under which they could not function. The pattern repeated in Burma, in Java, in every tropical or maritime environment the Mongols attempted to penetrate. The war machine that had shattered the civilizations of the temperate world was stopped. Consistently, by the combination of water, heat, and the refusal of jungle-adapted enemies to fight on the terms the Mongols required. Kublai Khan died in 1294, aged 79, after spending his final years drinking heavily and eating compulsively, an old man who had conquered China and failed to conquer Japan. Who had created the most sophisticated empire in Asia and watched its finances deteriorate. Who had built a dynasty that would last less than a century after his death. He was, by almost any measure, one of the most powerful human beings who ever lived. He ended his life in what his own courtiers described as grief and decline. The Yuan dynasty he left behind would survive him by only 74 years. In 1368, a Chinese peasant named Zhu Yanzhong led a rebellion that drove the Mongols back to the steppe and founded the Ming dynasty. The wall that the Chinese had always wanted to build, to separate the steppe from the settled world once and for all, was finally rebuilt. This time in the stone and brick that still stands today. The lesson of the Mongol conquest had been learned. It would not be forgotten for centuries. Asterism. Chapter 9. The Fracture. 4 Khanates and a Broken Dream, 1260 to 1350. The Mongol Empire was always, in a sense, a single man's achievement extended beyond its natural lifespan. Genghis Khan had built an empire held together by his personal authority, his carefully designed succession system, and the institutional loyalty he had spent a lifetime cultivating. His immediate successors had been capable enough to extend that achievement. But the fundamental tension in the Mongol imperial project, between the steppe tradition of dividing territory among a ruler's sons and the administrative reality that a unified empire required unified command, could only be papered over for so long. The paper tore in 1260. Mongol Khan's death in 1259 during the Song dynasty campaign triggered a civil war between his brothers Kublai and Arik Bok. Kublai, who had spent years governing northern China and had absorbed Chinese administrative culture so deeply that some Mongol traditionalists considered him more Chinese than Mongol, controlled the wealth and population of the east. Arik Bok, who represented the steppe traditionalists, controlled the Mongol heartland and the symbolic capital of Karakoram. The war lasted 4 years. Kublai won. Arik Bok surrendered in 1264 and died in captivity, possibly poisoned, 2 years later. But the victory cost Kublai something more important than the battles. It cost him the legitimacy that came from unanimous recognition by all branches of the Mongol ruling family. The Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state controlling Russia and the western steppe, ruled by the descendants of Genghis Khan's eldest son Hochi, refused to recognize Kublai's primacy. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia splintered into factions. The Il Khanate in Persia, ruled by Hulagu's descendants, maintained closer ties to Kublai's Yuan dynasty but was geographically and culturally separated from it by thousands of miles of hostile territory. By 1260, what had been the Mongol Empire was, in practical terms, 4 separate states: the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, the Il Khanate in Persia and Iraq, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe. They shared a common ruling family, a common origin myth, and occasional diplomatic communication. They also fought each other. The Il Khanate and the Golden Horde went to war repeatedly over the Caucasus region, a conflict that would outlast both states. The Yuan dynasty and the Chagatai Khanate maintained a long-running border dispute. The nominal unity of the empire, the idea that all Mongol rulers ultimately answered to a single great Khan, became a fiction within a generation of Genghis Khan's death, maintained in ceremonial language long after it had ceased to describe any political reality. Each successor state also underwent a process of cultural absorption that would have astonished, and perhaps disappointed, Genghis Khan. The Il Khans of Persia converted to Islam within 50 years of destroying the Abbasid Caliphate. The Golden Horde converted to Islam under Khan Uzbeg in the early 14th century. And the city of Sarai on the lower Volga became a major center of Islamic culture. The Yuan dynasty in China became, to all practical purposes, a Chinese dynasty that happened to have Mongol rulers, adopting Chinese administrative practices, Chinese court rituals, and eventually Chinese culture so thoroughly that the distinction between Mongol and Chinese became blurred in ways that horrified the steppe traditionalists. The Chagatai Khanate, which controlled the steppe heartland and had the least contact with the settled civilizations that absorbed the other successor states, remained the most traditionally Mongol, and was, correspondingly, the most politically unstable, riven by constant factional fighting between those who wanted to embrace settled life and those who insisted on maintaining the pastoral nomadic culture that had made the conquests possible. In each case, the Mongol rulers found themselves in a paradox that would have been familiar to every conquering people in history. The culture you conquer either destroys you by absorbing you, or destroys itself trying to resist you. The Mongols, who had conquered civilizations by being more ruthless and more mobile than anything the settled world had produced, found themselves, within 2 generations, becoming the settled world. They built palaces, they funded mosques and cathedrals, they patronized poets and painters, they learned the languages of the people they governed, and in learning those languages, they began to think in them. The Great Steppe Empire was becoming 4 smaller kingdoms, and 4 smaller kingdoms were becoming, each in their own way, part of the world they had set out to conquer. This transformation was not total failure. Some of the successor states were, by the standards of medieval governance, remarkably effective and surprisingly tolerant. The Il Khanate under Ghazan Khan in the early 14th century undertook a serious program of administrative reform and economic reconstruction that began reversing some of the damage of the initial conquest. The Golden Horde under Uzbeg Khan reached a peak of prosperity that made Sarai one of the great cities of the medieval world. But the momentum was gone. The unifying force, the sense of a single Mongol people moving together toward a single goal under a single authority, had dissipated into the regional politics of 4 separate states, each more interested in its own survival than in the shared imperial project. And from the east, a new catastrophe was gathering on the wind. Asterism. Chapter 10. The Fall, Plague, Civil War, and the End of the Khans, 1350 to 1368. In the summer of 1346, a Mongol army of the Golden Horde was besieging the Genoese trading city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. The siege had been going badly, not because of Genoese resistance, but because the Mongol camp had been struck by a devastating outbreak of disease. Men were dying by the hundreds, then the thousands. In days, the bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Whoever commanded the Mongol force at Kaffa made a decision that would alter the course of Western history. He ordered the bodies of his plague dead to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the walls of the city. The Genoese merchants who abandoned Kaffa and sailed back to Sicily in the autumn of 1346 carried something invisible with them. By the following spring, it was in Italy. By 1348, it was in France, Spain, and England. By 1350, it had reached Scandinavia. The Black Death, the bubonic and pneumonic plague pandemic triggered by Yersinia pestis, killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in 4 years. It killed comparable proportions across the Middle East and Central Asia. It killed tens of millions of people in China during the preceding decades, contributing to the collapse of the Yuan dynasty. The plague did not cause the fall of the Mongol Empire alone. The empire was already fracturing, already being absorbed into the cultures it had conquered, already weakened by the succession crises and civil wars that had repeatedly disrupted its governance. But the plague accelerated every weakness the empire possessed. In China, the Yuan dynasty faced a combination of plague deaths, catastrophic flooding of the Yellow River in the 1340s that destroyed harvests across northern China, and a fiscal crisis caused by decades of expensive failed military campaigns. Japan, Vietnam, the costs of maintaining a bureaucracy of unprecedented scale. Peasant rebellions that had been simmering for years exploded into open warfare across the Chinese countryside. Multiple rebel leaders emerged, fighting each other as much as they fought the Mongol overlords. The Yuan court in Beijing, physically removed from the steppe, culturally absorbed into Chinese elite society, dependent on a bureaucracy increasingly staffed by Chinese officials, had lost the military instincts that had made the original conquests possible. The Mongol cavalry that had been the empire's ultimate coercive instrument was dispersed, undersupplied, and in some cases had not been on campaign in a generation. When the rebel leader Zhu Yanzhong finally consolidated enough power to march on Beijing in 1368, the last Yuan emperor fled north to the steppe without a serious fight. He took with him the idea that a Mongol ruler still held the mandate of heaven, the Chinese philosophical concept of divinely sanctioned authority that Kublai Khan had been so careful to acquire a century before. For decades afterward, the Mongol court in exile maintained the fiction that it was the legitimate government of China, conducting court rituals and keeping records in a steppe camp that had no cities, no agriculture, and no population large enough to threaten the new Ming dynasty. The fiction faded within a generation. In Persia and Iraq, the Il Khanate collapsed in 1335 following the death of the last effective Il Khan without a clear successor. The territory fractured into a patchwork of smaller dynasties, Persian, Turkic, Kurdish, that fought over the ruins for decades. The agricultural and irrigation infrastructure that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization since the Sumerians, already badly damaged by the initial conquest, was not rebuilt. The population of Iraq would not return to pre-Mongol levels for 6 centuries. The Golden Horde lasted longer than its sister Khanates. Its control over the Russian principalities persisted in various forms until the late 15th century. And the memory of Mongol overlordship shaped Russian political culture in ways that historians still debate today. But the Golden Horde was racked by a political crisis in the mid-14th century during which some 24 different Khans claimed the throne in 20 years. Many of them ruling for months before being assassinated. The plague struck it hard. And in 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, a coalition of Russian princes under Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Golden Horde army for the first time in history, not destroying the horde, but demonstrating that it was no longer invincible. The final symbolic blow came not from outside the Mongol world but from within it. In the 1370s, a Central Asian warlord named Timur, Tamerlane in the Western sources, rose to power in the Chagatai Khanate, claiming descent from Genghis Khan's line and promising to restore Mongol greatness. What he actually built was something different, an empire of devastation that deliberately imitated the worst aspects of the early Mongol conquests without any of the administrative genius that had made the original empire function. Timur's campaigns through Persia, Iraq, India, and Anatolia in the late 14th century inflicted casualties and destruction comparable to the original Mongol conquests. He destroyed cities that had barely recovered from Hulagu's campaigns a century before, and created towers of skulls that became his signature. But Timur's empire was a performance of Mongol power rather than its reality. It had no administrative structure capable of outlasting his personal authority, no succession system, no institutional loyalty. When he died in 1405 on his way to conquer China, the one great prize that had always eluded the successors of Genghis Khan, his empire dissolved within 2 generations. The age of the great steppe empires was ending. The invention of gunpowder artillery had begun to alter the military equation that had made nomadic cavalry dominant for nearly 2,000 years. cannon and musket could now defend a wall against cavalry charges, could destroy the mobility advantage that had been the steppe warrior's primary weapon. The settled world was rearming, and the balance of power was shifting back. On the steppe itself, the Mongol tribes fragmented back into the competing clans and feuds that had characterized the world before Genghis Khan. The unity he had imposed, the greatest political achievement in steppe history, lasted less than 2 centuries before the centrifugal forces of tribal identity reasserted themselves. The descendants of Genghis Khan continued to claim his name and his authority as a source of political legitimacy. But the name had become a title rather than a living inheritance. Any steppe leader worth his horses claimed Chinggisid descent, whether he actually possessed it or not. The empire that had stretched from Korea to Hungary, that had destroyed more cities and killed more people and connected more cultures than any political entity in human history, had become a memory. A very long memory. Asterism. Epilogue. What the Mongols left behind. When you look at a map of the modern world, the Mongol Empire is everywhere, though it wears different names now. The borders of Russia were shaped, in significant part, by the Golden Horde's patterns of dominance and the Russian prince's strategies for surviving Mongol overlordship. The cultural memory of the Tatar-Mongol invasion, what Russians call the Tatar yoke, left a mark on Russian political culture that historians trace forward to the centralized, autocratic state that Russia has consistently rebuilt in every era of its history. The Russian instinct for geographic depth as a defense strategy, the tendency to trade space for time against invaders, has its roots in the 2 centuries of Mongol domination. The Middle East that exists today, its borders, its religious landscape, its political culture, was shaped decisively by the Mongol conquests. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Abbasid Caliphate and created a vacuum of Islamic political authority that has never been completely filled. The shift of the Islamic world's center of gravity from the cosmopolitan, intellectually adventurous culture of Abbasid Baghdad toward the more defensive, more conservative forms of Islam that emerged in the aftermath of the conquest is a transformation that some historians connect, at least in part, to the trauma of 1258. China's relationship with its northern frontier was permanently altered. The Ming dynasty, founded in the wake of the Mongol expulsion, built the Great Wall in its current stone form specifically as a psychological and physical barrier against any recurrence of what the Yuan dynasty represented, foreign rule. Steppe domination. The humiliation of having the oldest continuous civilization on Earth governed by horse-riding nomads from the north. The Ming retreat from the sea. The deliberate abandonment of the great Chinese naval exploration programs of the early 15th century, reflected in part a new inward focus. A turning away from the world and toward the security of walls. The plague that traveled the Mongol roads killed between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia and permanently altered the social structures of every society it touched. The labor shortages created by plague mortality in Europe accelerated the collapse of feudalism, contributed to peasant revolts, undermined the authority of institutions, the church, the nobility, that had seemed permanent, and created conditions that historians connect to the Renaissance and ultimately to the modern world. The Black Death reshaped European civilization so thoroughly that it is almost impossible to imagine what Europe would have looked like without it. The Mongol roads also moved ideas, technologies, and peoples in ways that are still unfolding. The printing press that Gutenberg built in the 1440s used techniques, oil-based inks, metal movable type, that drew on Chinese printing technology that had traveled west along the routes the Mongols maintained. Gunpowder artillery, which ended the age of castle warfare and the dominance of armored cavalry that had defined European military culture for centuries, reached Europe via the same pathways. The stirrup, the horseback archery techniques, the postal relay systems, all had traveled along routes that the Mongol peace had made safe enough to use. The Mongol Empire was, simultaneously, the greatest catastrophe and the greatest accelerant of cultural exchange that the pre-modern world ever experienced. It destroyed civilizations and it connected civilizations. It killed tens of millions of people and it created the conditions that allowed tens of millions of other people to trade, to travel, to exchange ideas across distances that had previously been impassable. Both things are true. Both things matter. And then there is the question of the man himself. Genghis Khan was born into poverty so complete that his family was abandoned to die on the steppe. He rose to command the largest empire in human history. He was, by the standards of his own culture, a man of genuine principle, loyal to those who were loyal to him, merciless to those who were not, committed to a code of justice that he applied with what his contemporaries regarded as unusual consistency. He was also responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 30 and 40 million human beings. Both of these things were true of the same person, and the attempt to reconcile them, or to choose between them, reveals more about the person making the attempt than it does about Genghis Khan. History does not offer us clean verdicts. The people who build the world are rarely the people we would choose to build it. The Mongol Empire was built by a man who had experienced, firsthand, every form of vulnerability and betrayal that the steppe could offer, and who responded by constructing the most efficient system of organized violence the world had yet seen, not from cruelty for its own sake, but from a clear-eyed understanding that in the world he inhabited, the only alternative to power was extinction. He was not wrong about his world. He was simply so effective at reshaping it that the world he understood ceased to exist, replaced by something he had made, something that carried his mark in ways he could not have anticipated and would not have fully recognized. The steppe that shaped him is still there. The grasslands still stretch from Hungary to Manchuria, still subject to the same brutal winters and unreliable summers that shaped the culture of the people who lived on them. The Mongol people still exist, in the nation of Mongolia and in the Inner Mongolian region of China. A population of roughly 10 million people who are among the most genetically distinctive on Earth. Studies suggest that approximately 8% of the men in the former Mongol Empire's territory, roughly 16 million people alive today, carry a Y chromosome haplotype that traces back to a single common ancestor who lived on the Mongolian steppe approximately 8,000 years ago. The genetic calculations suggest, with unsettling precision, that this ancestor was almost certainly Genghis Khan. He left his mark on the world in every sense that phrase can carry. The greatest conqueror in human history was born into nothing, on a steppe that tried to kill him, in a world that had no reason to remember him. He died as the ruler of half the earth, having remade the map of the world so thoroughly that its echoes are still audible today. In borders and languages and diseases and technologies and the 800-year-old trauma of civilizations that have never quite recovered from the wind that came out of the east. He was, in the most complete sense of the word, unforgettable. And the world he made, for better and for worse, in fire and in silk, in plague and in peace, is, in ways both visible and invisible, still the world we live in today. The greatest conqueror in history was born with nothing, on a steppe that tried to kill him. He died as the ruler of half the earth. And the world he made is still, 800 years later, the world we live in. That is what history does. It does not stay in the past. World Saga exists to find those stories, the ones that live inside our borders, our diseases, our trade routes, our political instincts, and tell them completely, without rushing past the parts that matter. The Mongols were one story. There are many more. If this journey meant something to you, subscribe, so the next saga finds you the moment it is ready. If a particular moment in this story stayed with you, a decision that changed history, a city that burned, a piece that connected the world, leave it in the comments. Tell me which part of the Mongol story you will carry with you. And if this video earned a like, it takes 3 seconds, and it matters more than you might think. This is World Saga, the story of humanity, one empire at a time. I will see you in the next one.